everyone. Welcome to the webinar on global analysis of policies to address oceanic plastic pollution. I'm Winnie Lau with the Preventing Ocean Plastics Project at the Pew Charitable Trust. I have the honor of moderating this webinar today. At present, the world is tackling the coronavirus pandemic, which deserves most of our attention. Once this pandemic subsides, our attention will have to redouble on the global challenges that we have been facing. And plastic pollution is among one of the most urgent environmental challenges of our time. Finding solutions to it will be important for the long-term health of people around the world and of our environment. In the next hour, we'll be sharing with you the findings and experts' reflections on the recently released report, 20 Years of Government Responses to the Global Plastic Pollution Problem. This work is a collaboration between the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University and the Pew Charitable Trusts. The impetus behind this work is to increase the evidence base on solutions for tackling the global plastic pollution problem. The Duke policy analysis is part of the larger Pew Preventing Ocean Plastics initiative and complements another soon-to-be released report by Pew and the partner Systemic on a global scenario analysis of solutions to reduce ocean plastic pollution. The findings of both of these reports are feeding into a global plastic roadmap that will be released this summer. With that, please let me introduce the Duke and Pew team that helped put this webinar together. From the Duke University's Nicholas Institute, we have Dr. John Virdin and Dr. Amy Pickle, who are the co-principal investigators of the research you'll be hearing about shortly, and Jeremy Ashton, the Senior Public Relations Specialist. From the Pew Charitable Trusts, in addition to myself, we have Laura Margison, Director of Communications, and Brandon McGillis, Communications Officer. For the format for today, we will begin with a 15-minute presentation by Dr. John Virdin, summarizing the key findings from the recently released report, followed by a 5-minute presentation by each of our 3 distinguished panelists. The first panelist is Dr. Tony Walker, Assistant Professor at the School of Resource and Environmental Studies at Dalhousie University in Canada. Tony will be speaking on the state of global policy to address plastic pollution. The second panelist is Dr. Kathinka Fürst, Associate Director of the Environmental Research Center and also Assistant Adjunct Professor of Environmental Policy at Duke Kunshan University in China. Kathinka will be speaking about her plastics policy work in China. And the third panelist is Ms. Heidi Savelli Soderberg, Program Officer on Marine Litter for the Global Program of Action for the Protection of the Marine Environment from Land-Based Activities at UN Environment. Heidi will be speaking on UN Environment's initiatives on ocean plastic pollution and monitoring of government responses. After the panelists' presentations, we'll have time for questions and answers. Please send us your questions using the Q&A box. You can open it by selecting the icon at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentations. During the Q&A portion, I'll select some questions to pose to our speakers. With that, I will turn this over to Dr. John Virdin to present the policy report. John.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much, Winnie, for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here and get to talk to everyone. I want to really quickly walk you all through this study that Winnie referenced that we've conducted, and tell you a little bit about why we did the study, what we found, and where this might be useful going forward. But before I do that, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that this study was the product of a large group of researchers whose names you hopefully see here, both from Duke University's Nicholas Institute, from Duke University's Marine Lab, in collaboration with the Pew Charitable Trust. And then we've also gotten fantastic input and help from Professor Walker here, Professor Fürst from Duke Kunshan University. So it's been a tremendous collaborative effort, and one that we really enjoyed. So what I want to tell you about is how this study aiming to look at essentially how governments have responded to the global plastic pollution problem over the last 20 years. And by 20 years, I mean from the start of the year 2000 to mid 2019. So we can think of this a little bit as a baseline or a before scenario for what governments were doing before the pandemic hit. And then we also wanted to try to summarize the state of the science on what we know about what's working from these government responses and what isn't to reduce plastic pollution. So I want to first walk you through what we did and didn't look at here. And just to be very clear, when we say public policies or government responses, we're looking at the international agreements, national laws and regulations, local laws, local ordinances, essentially the public policies at all levels of government around the world, explicitly aiming to reduce the leakage of plastic at some stage in the life cycle of a given plastic product. So we were casting the net broadly, so to speak, but we also didn't include general solid waste management policies, which we know are fundamental to reducing plastic pollution. Governments, we consider those as part of the business as usual scenario. Governments are constantly adjusting, adding to solid waste management policies, expanding their solid waste management capabilities. We consider that things that are happening and going on anyway. And on top of that, we wanted to look at those public policies that are explicitly aiming to address plastic pollution at some point in the life cycle. So that's what this study is about. And what we did, and there have been a number of good global reviews in the last few years starting to look at this. Professor Walker has done one of the leading ones. And there are a number of ways to go about this, because it is, in a sense, finding a needle in a haystack, particularly if you're looking for local laws, local ordinances from every city, town, or around the world. Gathering all this up and starting to sort of systematically collect and analyze all of these government responses to the plastic pollution problem is a pretty arduous task. And the way that we went about it is that, fortunately, there are a number of international databases that include laws and policies that governments have passed regarding the environment at the international level, the national level. And then there are a number of scientific resources, papers, things where others have reported on these that we tried to review. And then we also just looked at media feeds and things that are reported. And so we really tried to do two things that would help us understand how governments were responding to this global problem. We tried to pull together from all these sources a global inventory that we've called the Plastics Policy Inventory. It's essentially a list of all of the different policies that governments have introduced at different levels, explicitly aiming to address plastic pollution. So we've got this large list now that we can then start to study and do some analytics on. And that's where we opened up each of these policy documents and reviewed that. And then at the same time, we tried to form a library, we've called, for lack of a better word, the Plastics Policy Library, that showed essentially all of the scientific reviews of what's working and what isn't. And so from those two tools, we started to conduct these reviews and these analysis of exactly what governments are doing and what science is telling us is working and isn't working. And just to be clear, this Plastics Policy Inventory is one of the first that we know of to try to systematically track government responses to this problem. It's certainly not exhaustive by any means. It is, at the international level, we feel like it's fairly exhaustive. We are confident that of all the known policies that we see referenced somewhere in the literature, even in media feeds and press releases and news articles, most of them we have actually found the policy documents themselves and can do some analysis on them. At the national level, we think that what we have is pretty indicative of what governments are doing at the national level around the world, but it's certainly not complete. There are a number of things referenced out there. where we just couldn't find the law or the regulation. There might be a news feed that says the government here in this country has just introduced a ban on plastic bottles or a recycling program for plastic bottles, but we can't find it anywhere in any language, in any database. So we know it may be out there, but we haven't found it, and so weren't able to analyze it. And then of course at the local level, what we have are really just examples. We're really just scratching the surface there, because there are so many local ordinances and local laws that have been passed that we know we haven't been able to track down just yet. But we hope that this is a good start, this inventory, and we're going to keep it living and keep updating it. And it already has been useful to tell us a few things. And so I guess the first thing that jumped out at us, and this is probably intuitive and been seen before, but at all levels, at the international level, at the national level, at the local level, governments have been increasing their responses to this problem over the last decade. We've seen an increasing number of policies at every level, this trend of increased attention by governments, increased action on it at every level. So that's been increasing across the board. Now, one of the things that we've known that they've been doing and they've been using is net bans. We looked at what governments are doing, how they're doing it, what are the ways that they're responding to this. And it's been interesting to see that increasingly the way that governments are tackling this problem is increasingly they're banning different forms of plastics, typically plastic bags. And so that's been far and away the most common tool that governments are using in these policies. We see at the national level, what national governments are doing has been an increasing number of bans on plastic bags or other tools to address plastic bags. So the clear trend that we see around the world at the national level from national governments is they're tackling plastic bags. They're banning them typically, some places taxing them, introducing levies, fees on those. And as of mid-2019, about 43 countries around the world had introduced some form of ban, tax, fee on plastic bags, representing a population of about 952 million people. Or if you include the policies in China and India, then you get a massive bump up to 3.7 billion people. But clearly, the driver of this trend of increasing government responses to plastic pollution over the last decade has been this focus on plastic bags at the national level. We see that governments are responding differently to some extent in geographies, particularly in lower income countries. At the national level, there's really been a focus on bans rather than taxes to some extent. And really out of this trend, it's been lower income countries that have been leading the way, at least in the sample that we have in this inventory. Out of the policies that we have in the inventory, 33 of the 43 countries are lower income countries. Far and away, the largest number that we've seen are in sub-Saharan Africa, where national governments are introducing plastic bag bans in some form or fashion. Far less attention from what we've seen so far has gone to microplastics, interestingly. I mean, there's increasing science in recent years about the prevalence of microplastic pollution in the ocean, but in terms of the government response, the policy response, we haven't really seen it yet at the national level in our sample. Only 9 national policies that we found that explicitly targeted microplastics in some way, and these are largely a phenomenon in Europe and North America over the last decade or more. One of the things that was interesting, one thing that we just compared was looking at the geography of responses, where governments are responding to this problem and where they're not in our sample, in our inventory. And what we found is, if we look at the top 20 plastic polluting countries, according to the models that Professor Jambak and others used in the 2015 paper in Science, as just one example of some of the top 20 producers of mismanaged plastic waste, 7 of those 20 countries we couldn't find a national policy in the inventory anywhere. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but we certainly couldn't find it. And another 4 of those 20 countries only have national policies that target at plastic bags, but not other single-use plastics or microplastics or any of the broader range of plastic pollutants. So it was interesting to us just to see that that doesn't mean all these countries have introduced or not policies. It certainly doesn't mean that just because a country has a policy that it's solving the problem or having an impact. But just as a starting point, in our sample, in our inventory, over half of these top 20 polluting countries from the Jamback-et-al. Models don't have a national policy in the inventory, or they only have a policy targeting plastic bags. So that was instructive, I think, for us in looking at there may still be some significant geographic gaps in where governments are responding. One of the things that we then looked at with this library of the scientific papers, gray literature that are trying to measure some effect of these policies, what's working and what isn't. We screened over 13,000 returns from our searches and came up with an inventory of about 130, or a library of about 136 papers that we reviewed. From those, very few actual quantitative measures of impact. Almost all of these papers and measures are again focusing on the impact of policies targeted to plastic bags, certainly none on microplastics. There's definitely a long time lag between when these policies are typically introduced and when there's a study published measuring some effect, about 6.5 years in our library. And a relatively small number of the national policies in our inventory have a study out there looking at what has worked and what hasn't. So this seems to be a clear research gap out there in the science, although one that is being filled. I mean, the number of studies is increasing and is growing. So I think the research community has been responding, but I think there's a ways to go from what we've seen here. We still don't, many of these policies are relatively recent. We still don't know a lot about what is working and what hasn't. Interestingly, among all of these studies looking at the effects of plastic bag policies, we find, although there's a wide range, this significant amount, all of these show some significant reductions in plastic bag consumption as a result of the policy over the short term, whether it was a ban or whether it was a tax. Regardless, there was a consistent trend in significant reductions in plastic bag consumption as after these instruments and these policies were introduced, ranging from, as you see here, the 20% up to 80 or 90% in between. At the same time, there were unintended consequences typically reported, such as increased use sometimes of other types of non-reusable bags, paper bags, plastic garbage bags. So there were unintended consequences as a result of this, but nonetheless, from the scientific literature, there seems to be a clear and significant trend in reduction of plastic bag consumption after these policies have been introduced, though these other effects are noted. So I'm gonna wrap up there because I want to leave time for our other panelists to come in, and I certainly want to look forward to the question and answer. But I'll just say that what we've seen and what we've tried to do here was to form this first plastics policy inventory that we can keep living, we can keep building as a tool to track globally how governments are responding to this problem, and also to inform governments as they design these responses of what other countries in similar situations, other towns, cities are doing to address this problem, and then maybe give us an indication of where there are some gaps. And then certainly to pull from this what we know about what's working and what isn't, which again is largely focused on plastic bags at the moment and what's being studied. And then to see from this also what scientists, what the research community, what experts have been consistently recommending to policymakers that they should be doing. And there are a number of those recommendations that we've highlighted in the report. Interestingly, it's pretty consistent, and I think some of our panelists can mention that there's been a recommendation of the need for a global treaty, a global convention on plastics, so to speak, that has a global binding and measurable target for plastic pollution reduction from each country or countries collectively. That's certainly been missing in international agreements to date. But I think I'll stop there and pass back over to you all with thanks, Winnie.
Thank you, John. That was an incredible analysis by you and your team. It's really encouraging to see that progress has been made at all levels of government. It'll be interesting to see how the policy landscape evolves from here. So our next speaker is Tony Walker. Tony, in light of the research John has just presented, where do you see governments going from here, and what might be some barriers, especially in light of COVID-19? Over to you, Tony.
Yeah, okay. So I was given a little bit of a prep before today. And so John had asked me, what is the current state of these plastic policies in general? And really, I'd be reiterating what John's already, expertly articulated. It's been, unquestionably a rapidly increasing trend over the last 20 years, and probably more so in 10 years. As John mentioned, it's primarily targeted plastic bags. But it's also, some jurisdictions are now extending those policies to include other single-use plastics. I've had a lot of critics in my time starting this research myself, saying, explaining that bags only contribute such a minor, by mass anyway, portion of the waste stream, which is true in many jurisdictions. However, the counter argument to that is we are seeing increasing awareness from the general public. And so whilst a ban may seemingly be the tip of the iceberg in terms of plastic pollution, it does help change the overall behavior of how people interact with not just plastic bags, but other types of unnecessary single-use plastics. And I think that's a great thing. That's a great trend, many of which governments recognize as well, as they've also expanded their scope. But what I think what we have seen in the literature, and John's pointed it out, effectiveness measures need to be put in place, more stringent and more rigorous. At the moment, it's largely anecdotal. It would be great to get more quantitative data, but I would still argue it's in the positive direction, aside from the unintended consequences. All of these can be overcome once sustainable alternatives are introduced. And many of these bans or taxes are not aimed at taking out plastic bags from from general use and simply replacing it with another single-use item. I think the overall intent is to change people behavior, so they'll reuse reusable bags or even do without entirely. And so whilst we've seen this increasing trend, it's been disrupted by the pandemic. We're all experiencing that. If you go to a grocery store now here in Canada and you do a curbside pickup, it comes out with grocery bags. So a little piece of me dies inside when I see that. However, I do recognize that based around fears of COVID transmission. But I think what it does signal, though, is a bit of a wake-up call for the planet. So we'll see this big rise in tide of, billions of, hundreds of billions of face masks used monthly and gloves, as well as reintroduction of, or should I say postponement of plastic bag bans, or even reversal. But I honestly think that's in the short term. Once we overcome when we see the other side of this pandemic, I think society and governments will move even faster to source alternatives, to implement bans or taxes or reduction policies more strategically as the pandemic subsides. And I think the final comment that you asked, Winnie and John, was what are the barriers? Well, aside from the fact that we're in a pandemic right now, I think once we come out of that, I think the barriers will be making sure that recycling of plastics can go into a circular economy. One barrier right now is the low oil prices. So virgin plastics look more attractive than their recycled counterparts. Unfortunately, the recycled counterparts, there's very little global market now after the China ban a couple of years ago, plus the low oil prices right now. But the other barrier, I think, is concerns over food, health, safety after this pandemic, but also largely driven by sustainable alternatives. John mentioned that unintended consequences, including people switching to heavier plastic bags or paper bags, which are, you know, still single-use items. But you know, I think if we can really overcome that particular barrier, that will be a great way for industry and corporations to get on board if there are genuinely sustainable alternatives. So that really concludes my five minutes for now, Winnie. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tony. It's really interesting to hear what you think might happen after the pandemic. And then, of course, China will be an important player in all of this. And I think our next speaker, Kathinka Fürst, will be well placed to talk about what's happening in China. Kathinka, what have you been doing? What research have you been doing? And where do you think the China policy landscape is heading? And are there lessons to be learned for other countries? Kathinka, over to you.
Thank you so much, Winnie. I'll just say a few words about why we wanted to include a China deep dive into this policy, building on the work that John and the team at the Nicholas Institute have been doing. I'll say a few words about what we found so far and some of the next steps that we hope to work on over the summer and in the fall. So as John mentioned in the introduction, a lot of what they capture in the global analysis doesn't necessarily reflect what's going on the subnational level. And given that China is one of the world's largest producer and consumer of plastic projects, and also because of how policies in China reflects and affects the global waste management system, we thought it would be interesting to look at what happens on subnational level in China. So we basically adopted the methodology that the team at Nicholas Institute has developed, and we tried to then do a really comprehensive analysis of the plastic related regulations and documents in China, and to try to kind of understand what is happening here. And it's still early days for us. Our work has also been disrupted by the pandemic. But I also have a great team of researchers that are working with me. We have so far found more than 200 policies and regulations that are related to plastic waste in China. But many of these are what John mentioned to be more like these general waste management policies, and they do not necessarily explicitly focus on plastic issues. So out of these 200 policies, there are about 43 that we find to be most relevant to look at more in depth. And the team is now working on a more in-depth analysis of these and coding of these. And we're hoping that by the end of the summer, we will have finalized the coding and we can prevent some more in-depth analysis. So for now, what I'm about to present is just really some preliminary findings of what we have found so far. And out of these 200 policies, which seems to be a lot, what we found is that there are a lot of duplicates from a national restriction order or national law or policy that then is kind of duplicated on provincial or subnational level. So for instance, the 2008 ban on plastic shopping bags then kind of trickled down, one step by the other, first to provincial level, then to city level, then to even lower administrative levels. So whereas, the numbers seem quite significant, when we start to look at this in more in-depth, we find that they're actually very similar to the kind of plastic restrictive orders that were just given at a higher administrative level. Of course, whether or not these policies and regulation will actually reduce the number of plastic projects still remains unknown. So like John was mentioning for the global study, we have little knowledge about the actual effect of these this ban. Another key finding that we found was that, of course, many of the issues of the policies or the instruments or tools that are relevant for plastic reductions are reflected in kind of waste sorting management systems, or they pop up in soil pollution prevention and control programs. We find some mentioning of this in the more kind of political discourses of ecological civilization and construction in China. So these are provisions that are not intended to limit plastic waste per se, but to kind of prevent litter more generally and keep the environmental clean. Interestingly, this year we had more of an updated version of the 2008 plastic restriction order, which is more detailed. It emphasizes the need to replace traditional plastic with degradable plastics. However, it does not really provide a clear definition or explanation of what counts as degradable plastic projects. So we're very uncertain about how this kind of new version of the plastic restriction order will play out, and what would be the implications of that. John mentioned that there were very few policies that mentioned microplastics. We haven't looked into this in China, but I would be surprised to see if we found anything related to microplastics in China. What we have looked at a little bit already is whether or not we can find any mentioning of marine plastic waste in Chinese policies. And we have thus far failed to do so. There are some regulation that does mention ocean-related issues in kind of the waste stream, but only for the purpose of preventing ships from dumping garbage into the ocean, and not so much related to marine plastic waste or litter per se. The good news is, and I think this is kind of reflects what John was also talking about, is that China is, and Tony also, that there's more awareness in China, both among the general public, but also among policymakers with regards to the threats that is derived from plastic waste and plastics in general. We see a number of policies and regulations that are related to plastic waste that has been introduced just this year, and that there are more that have been proposed. We see that in the annual National People's Congress, there are more and more so-called people's representatives that are raising issues related to plastics. We also see that in a lot of the new environmental reports, specifically in the newly released marine environmental reports, there is a focus on marine plastic and microplastics. So I think in a similar way that we saw in the global study, it is likely that we will also have an increased introduction of new policies coming out from China in the next couple of years. So that's kind of what we found so far. Some of the things that we wanted to do next is to try to understand why different provinces or cities have adopted different policies. We want to look at kind of landlocked provinces and see how they react or respond to the plastic issues, even though they are kind of landlocked, but many of them have the Yellow River and important rivers run through them. So these are, of course, important issues as well. And then finally, we hope to use this kind of country case study methodology to perhaps look at some of the other countries that are also important. I think that's my 5 minutes. Winnie is asking me to wrap up, so I'll do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kathinka. It's actually really heartening to hear that there are lots of policies as well at this subnational level in China. And it's really interesting to hear that at the subnational level, many of the policies are duplicating national level policies. So it's important to keep in mind then how policies can trickle down. And I think that leads really well to our next speaker, Heidi Savelli. Heidi, obviously the plastic pollution problem is one that no single country can solve alone. So be great to hear what UN Environment is doing regarding global and regional initiatives to tackle this problem. And I'll turn it over to you. Thanks, Heidi.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this session. So I'll go around, use my 5 minutes to go through a bit of what we're doing at international levels. We have worked on this topic for more than 25 years through the Global Program of Action for the Protection of the Marine Environment from Land-Based Activities, as well as the work of the 18 regional seas conventions and action plans at regional level. And we were asked to establish the Global Partnership on Marine Litter in 2012 to ensure that there is a good multi-stakeholder collaboration in trying to address this topic. As mentioned by John, we also have the UNEA action, where then 4 resolutions since 2014 have been adopted that have led to also ensuring that there is a global agenda now that's being driven by countries on how to take action and how to solve this problem. So UNEA requested us to do an inventory also of international instruments and regional instruments, where we looked at 18 international and 36 regional, and where we then, in the report to UNEA 3, highlighted that there were, of course, no binding instruments with primary objective of reducing marine plastic litter and microplastics. There are many others, but not as the primary objective that could potentially also pick up this topic. There is no global institution to coordinate, gaps in geographic coverage, lack of global standards, and also no mechanism at the global level for effective compliance and enforcement or for liability and compensation. So the governance situation at the global and regional level is quite fragmented, and there is right now nothing to adequately address the global issue. So UNEA picked up this and established an ad hoc open-ended experts group on marine plastic and microplastic that was to examine and discuss some of these issues related to what needs to happen, what are barriers, what are solutions to barriers, but also what are economic and social implications of potential solutions. So that group has met 3 times, and we as UNEP facilitate the work of the group. We provide a secretariat. And as part of the latest work program of this group, they've been asked to look at both the stock taking, what are actions and activities done by all stakeholders. It's not meant to be comprehensive, but rather give an idea of maybe trends and also where is action happening and where might it not be happening so much. We're also doing inventories of technical and financial resources and mechanisms. We're looking at assessment of the effectiveness of different response options as well. And the work of this group is to provide options for the consideration of the UN Environment Assembly taking place in February 2021. So that's the 5th session of that. As part of the stock taking, then we also provided an opportunity for those wishing to consider submitting input to it to indicate also where does their action fall. So there were 4 different options, where one was specifically an action that involved legislation, creating rules or rule changes and standards around marine plastic litter. So of the 158 submissions that were received in the first 2 months, this is an ongoing process, so it's still possible to submit. We had about 30% of the submissions were related to legislation, standards, and rule actions. And these submissions came about 50 from governments, and then other groups and stakeholders. So it's an ongoing process. And of these ones, about 28 actions were looking at legislation or regulations, and 27 more policy change and development related. And there were much less frequent reporting on actions that targeted taxes or subsidies or financial incentives to affect a reduction in marine plastic litter. We also had a narrative submission where we looked again at policy frameworks that respondents submitted, with 23 countries submitting and 42 in total. Where we see that there is a continued updating of different types of legislation or putting in place new ones. National frameworks are seen to dominate the approaches, but there were a frequent reference to the European Union's Marine Strategy Framework Directive as well in this. So about 1/4 of the submissions reported that they've introduced bans on single-use plastics, bags and straws, and or microplastics, so microplastics in cosmetics. And about 1/4 submissions mentioned fiscal incentives or disincentives. So this work is ongoing to the 31st of July. We really encourage anyone on this call or any partners or anyone who wishes to highlight the work that they're doing so that this can be factored in and feed into the work of the group. It's super exciting to see this analysis, and there will be also webinars summarizing this. And I wanted to highlight that then, of course, the activities that you have been doing, that would be excellent if they could be submitted also so that they can be properly acknowledged and mapped when looking at what the situation is at the global level. And in addition, we are working also in relation to policy support on the linkage between data and policy. So what type of data is needed to properly assess whether a policy is efficient or if it's meeting its intended objective. So if you want to address plastic bags, do you have the data on plastic bags in the environment or do you not? Then it's difficult to come back once that policy is in place to be able to measure if there was an improvement in the marine plastic litter situation, if that was your intended outcome. So we're working through also massive open online courses that will be running now in September again. We are working on national source inventories to promote the establishment of national action plans on marine litter, building on the 12 regional ones that are existing and 4 drafts. And that includes a national policy review. So to support again what policies are in place within a country to support the action that might need to be taken. So that includes also baseline setting on the marine litter situation in the environment. And I wanted to maybe mention something additional. We are very keen in looking at how the work you have done could also feed into the work that we're doing on data and connecting different types of information and data to have a kind of integrated analysis of both gaps and areas of progress. So the use of innovation and digital tools is very important to us, and we are working on a digital multi-stakeholder platform. It's part of a collaboration between the Global Partnership Marine Litter and the Science Policy Business Forum, and we would invite anyone interested in taking part of this to be part of shaping it going forward. Last but not least, riverine input is of course very important, and I'd be very curious to see if there are any policies focusing also on pathways. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Sounds like there's a lot going on at UN Environment, the monitoring, the inventories, the platforms, and not to mention potentially a future international binding agreement. So looking forward to the continued efforts from UN Environment, really bringing all the different levels together that all of the panelists have spoken about today. So first off, I want to thank John, Tony, Kathinka, and Heidi again for sharing their insights. I think there's a lot of reason for hope that we can solve this growing environmental challenge. And your presentations have clearly been very thought-provoking. We've received many questions from the audience, and thank you for being such an engaged audience. I'm going to start off with a couple of questions, particularly directed at John, Kathinka, and Heidi. A few of the questions touched on the transboundary issue, particularly of waste being imported and exported between countries. Did you see many policies, John, that tackled this issue? And then Kathinka, how do you think the China ban might evolve in the next few years? And then Heidi, what do you think we can further do at the global community level to really manage the import and export of plastic waste better? So I'll start with John.
Yeah, thanks, Winnie. Just briefly, we didn't see very many policies, at least at the national level, that were focusing at the import and export stage. Certainly the China ban that you mentioned is one of the most prominent, but not as many from what we saw. Now, we still need to look. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, has a database of trade policies. There's still a need to mine that. We didn't. So there may be additional places to look to find some that are out there. But from what we have, that wasn't as much of a focus of what national governments were doing.
Great, thank you. So it seems like we might need some more focus on that. Kathinka, what is happening in China, do you think, on the import-export of waste?
Well, I think given that China is now making such a huge effort on domestic waste management and treatment, it's very unlikely that we'll see a loosening up of that ban in the coming years. I think, on the contrary, China is going to be more strict on wanting to import any waste as it's struggling with managing their own domestic waste. So, I think we still need to learn more about and understand more about the impact that has, like where has all that waste gone, and what are the other countries that are now starting to import that waste, and how well equipped are they to do that. But I don't think any of us want to see, that ban is going to be loosened up in any time soon. I think quite the contrary, it's just going to become stricter.
Great. Thanks, Kathinka. Heidi, is there anything that could be, should be done, could be done at the international level?
Well, I think that at the international level, there's good progress through, for example, if we're looking at the transboundary trade with the amendments to the Basel Convention, that will enter into force then January next year, I believe. So that's an excellent step towards both increasing the transparency of this trade, and also, but how do you measure the impacts of them? We don't know at the moment. There's a lot of plastics being shipped to developing countries, and we don't know what fraction of that is actually the one that's leaking into the ocean then. So I find it really interesting to look at those trends, and also see that there is a tendency of pointing fingers at certain countries and regions, and granted there is need for action everywhere, and with perhaps more in some places, but also factoring in the fact that there's a lot of shipping that is occurring from developed countries to developing countries, and then there needs to be appropriate technical support that goes along with that, if that is to continue, which is of course up to the individual countries. So the transparency issue, I think, and the also better disclosure and tracking of where things are going, and eventually, of course, solving the issue at the national level rather than shipping it off somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Heidi. Well, hopefully that we'll have some progress on that in UN Environment, maybe Basel, and as well as at the national level. There are questions on general waste management. Is it a limitation of this work to not look more broadly at general waste management? I'll ask John to speak on that, as well as Tony. What are the challenges of looking at these policies more broadly, and then also particularly on bans. We, as you said, John, there are a lot of policies on bans, and what are the enabling conditions to allow other types of policies to thrive? So we'll start with Tony first. What are your thoughts on general waste management, and why are there so many bans? And then John, if you could speak to how this work looked at plastics in relation to general waste management.
Yes, so thank you, Winnie. I think my opinion in terms of the rapid, sharp increase of bans around the world or other policy tools is, whilst it's a trend, there's been a sharp increase since China implemented the ban in December 31st, 17. And what that caused a ripple effect throughout the developing countries that were exporting their recycled waste, or let's call it pollution transfer. And so they didn't have capacity to deal with it domestically. And so overnight, it created a ripple effect where municipalities were overwhelmed with stockpiling waste. And so the solution, some kind of ban, whether it was thought through properly or not, you saw a lot implemented in 2018 and beyond. And more longer term, I think municipalities are recognizing, and governments, that they have to build capacity domestically to improve their recycling rates, which, as we know globally, is a measly 9% and lower in some jurisdictions. So yeah, domestic capacity all round needs to improve.
Great, thanks. John?
Yeah, just to add, I mean, as Tony mentioned, and many scientists have stated, solid waste management, recycling capacity, fundamental tool in addressing this problem for governments. We admittedly were not able to capture the breadth of general solid waste management policies, many of which focus on recycling, but do so generally and broadly and not explicitly aiming at plastic. We took stock of those. The World Bank has a nice summary called What a Waste that reviews the waste management capacity country by country around the world. We sort of summarized that as the baseline upon which we built, and we studied what governments have been doing additionally to that, specifically targeted to plastic, but admittedly knowing that that's a piece of the toolbox. And we just couldn't try to summarize and catalog the breadth of solid waste management policies out there that are generally applicable.
Great, thank you. So I've also had a lot of questions for you, Heidi. How can people input into the UN Environment Initiatives? Could you put the link? I see you've already done that. You've already put the links to the UN Environment Initiatives for those of you who are interested in supporting those efforts. So I also want to, we have still lots of questions coming in. What do you think we can do in terms of enabling factors? And I'm gonna ask each of the panelists to kind of speak to their thoughts on what are the enabling factors that we'll need in order to really raise the ambition of policies tackling plastic pollution. So we'll start with John.
Well, thanks, Winnie. I'll just go really quickly to try to summarize the enabling factors that we saw consistently in the scientific literature, as well as some of the gray literature that looked at these policies. Admittedly, largely these were plastic bag policies, but the ones that were most commonly cited were for those policies that are economic instruments using taxes or levies. The price that you, or the level that you set that tax or fee really matters. Secondly, the availability of inexpensive alternatives to particularly for bans was consistently cited as a critical enabling factor to any effectiveness. Enforcement, of course, it's intuitive, but the level of enforcement definitely affects the compliance and the impact of the instrument. But lastly, I think the one I want to emphasize the most, because I think we saw it most consistently across the literature, was efforts in public education and awareness raising and campaigns. And it was surprising how rarely these instruments and efforts at information campaigns, awareness, education were coupled with things like bans or taxes or levies, but that was consistently cited across the literature as increasing the effectiveness of these and enabling more success, so to speak. So that's one that I think jumped out at me the most from what we saw.
Great, that's really interesting. Tony, what do you think is some of the key enabling conditions?
Yeah, I agree with John on many of those, and one I was going to bring up, but definitely lead time. And what I mean by lead time is that education and awareness. And so from our analyses back in the summer of 2016, it was published in 17, we had to do an update a year after because it's a rapidly changing field. We found that governments that just announced it one week and then implemented a ban the following week was just not sufficient. It didn't really work out. Shops and grocery stores had huge backlog of stock. And also people didn't know where to source alternatives, even if they existed. And so changing behavior overnight doesn't work. The key is education and introduce the alternatives, sustainable as well as cost effective, at the same time are key factors to help enabling, I think is the right word, and also to get industry on board too. There's money to be saved here if industry does not have to purchase plastic bags, if the shoppers themselves or consumers have a mechanism to get the produce back home.
Great, thanks, Tony. Kathinka, what is your quick enabling condition?
Yeah, I think Tony and John has already mentioned most of what's important. I think salience, right, like making this an urgent issue, which is hard in the midst of all the other things that are on our mind right now. But so definitely awareness, capacity building, and I think also I really agree with Tony on bringing the industry on board. And I think that's one of the things that we are, I guess, surprised and a bit disheartened to see, that there's so few policies that actually try to incentivize new technology and new innovation towards solving the plastic issue. But I also think data, right, data and science, and more knowledge about what works and how it works is an important enabling factor in pushing for new policies and more agenda. So yeah, getting more research and more good knowledge on that is also important.
Great, thank you. And Heidi, I think you might have a similar message, but over to you.
Thanks. Yes, I agree. The data is, of course, crucial. Also to drive more, instead of piecemeal policies that may address one individual product or a certain polymer, you could have, by having a data on what are the top 10 items, for example, of polymers that is of most concern to your country, you can create a policy that is more comprehensive and doesn't address only one item or polymer. So I think that's a key message. Then I also think that the whole enabling factor, both in relation to technical resources, finances, of course, but also the information. There's always a considerable kind of pushback from businesses and industries that are concerned about job loss. So how can we make better available examples where countries may have found ways of shifting so that shifting production patterns or distribution patterns so that it doesn't affect small and medium-sized enterprises. So that could be another area where we would like to try and collect information so that there is a bit of a toolkit almost, that if you are going to implement a policy, you have the data in place, you have the evidence in place, because that is important for people to believe, you know, that the policy is a necessity. Then I think that together with everything else that has been said, those are very important factors.
Great, thank you so much, Heidi. And I think this is a great place to end the webinar as we are coming up on the hour. I think there are lots of things for all of us to think about, and hopefully some new ideas, new thinking for us to take back to our work and really accelerate the change we need to solve this global plastic pollution problem. So thank you for joining us today, and I'd like to thank our panelists again for sharing their time and their knowledge. If you're interested in the report, the policy inventory, as well as the Pew work, you can find the links to these online resources in the chat box. And there were many more questions and we could answer. Please feel free to reach out to us to have a deeper discussion. We welcome that. And I hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.